And welcome back. So yesterday we basically set up the um, local version of the Remix storefront with the Vendure backend, and it's all running locally. If you remember, we have our database connected to the local Postgres database that's running on my machine here, and then we have the front end and back end running here. The next step we want to do is we want to get this running on an app on DigitalOcean. So let's go into and last time we also set up a managed database. It's a Postgres database. And then we started to fill in our environment variables here. Wait, what? These all look good. The only thing that has to change, I believe, is when we deploy, we have to get rid of this app environment, if I remember correctly. We set this up so that if it's in dev mode, we're using localhost. So I have to get out of dev mode. Create app. My internet is a little slow. I'm trying to pause in between some of the stuff. So here in the app setup, we're going to click GitHub, and we're going to link our GitHub here. So we're going to start with the front end, demo front end repo that we made. We're going to be on the master branch. Our source is going to be in the root directory, and we're going to use auto deploy so that it updates every time the application is every time you push to the main branch or to the master branch. We'll click next. That looks fine. Then we're going to add a resource here. And we're going to add a detect from source code. And we're going to do the same thing with our backend here. So I've selected the backend. It's going to be on the main branch, root directory. Next. Now on the backend, it picked up that we have a Docker file, but it can also run it as a normal web service without the Docker file. So we're going to not use a Docker file since I didn't check it, I didn't customize it or anything like that. So we're just not going to go that route. We're just going to use this without the Docker file. Anything else? I think that's it. It's just going to be those two. So let's click next here. And then we're going to set up our environment variables. So the front end, I believe we had just one variable. So we're going to put that here. And we're actually going to modify this to the HTTP request to our backend app project, which I believe we're just going to call demo backend. Something like this. Save that. And then we're going to do the same for the backend. And the difference here is instead of CA certificate, we're going to do underscore self dot. Yeah, this will be CA cert. For more information on this, you can just in DigitalOcean just look up like environment variables or how to use environment variables. And they have actually like a bunch of them available that we could probably plug in for maybe some of this stuff as well. But that's not something I've done, so we're just not going to do it at this point. And the last thing we're going to do is erase this app development. We have our environment variables. We will pay $48. Okay. Let's create this. I'm gonna pause. And we have our first deployment error, just as we planned. So unfortunately, at this part of the video streaming or the screen capture got frozen on this one error where you see basically unable to connect to database or PB config, something with the PB config error. So that one that was showed just there. And so I have to kind of backtrack and try to cover try to show some of the changes that weren't showing up on screen. So once you run into that error, what what I ended up doing was I realized that that's an error that's related to the SSL certificate authentication. And what we forgot to do was uncomment this little SSL section here, which I believe was shown earlier in the previous video. We commented this out. So we had to uncomment this section. And then what I did was I pushed again, I built it, and that ran into another error where we weren't able to read from the tables. It was trying to access tables in the database, and it was causing an error. And so to overcome that, what uh, I'll typically do when that happens is I'll set synchronize to true, since we never filled our database with any default data or prepped it in any way, primed it. Um, we have to build it with synchronize set to true, and that will basically refresh the database. And then when we're actually all set up, then we want to switch this back to false because it'll just keep it could just keep basically refreshing our database, and that could lose information. The very next error that you'll see pop up most likely has to do with this spec, the app spec file, and you can access this in your app settings, and then making sure you're clicked on the app. So you should have the option to go into the app settings, your main app settings, or into the front end or back end settings. So you just want to make sure you're in your app settings and you scroll down and you should see something called a spec file. If you open your spec file, it's basically a YAML file that looks something similar to this. Since I'm recording this after everything was deleted, I just kind of took a basic one and modified it to sort of match the context which was used in the video. But further in the video, in this video, you'll see the most updated version, or you'll see a new updated version. So it's not super critical, but the only point I want to show on this is the next error you see will say something like deployment health check failed health checks on deployment. And what that is implying is, or what that's pertaining to is the HTTP port that the service is being served on or served to, whatever the correct term is set to 8080 by default. But we want to switch that to port 3001. And so you can see here that we set it to, let's see, so that should be, this one is set to port 3001. Our front end is still set to port 8080. Yeah, so update the HTTP port on the back end to port 3001, and then that should handle the deployment health check error. And then at that point, it should build, and at least what I saw is it built okay. And then when you go into your front end path, your live application that it gives you, it actually it didn't show anything. It's just a blank screen, and it said like server error. Wasn't very descriptive. It just said server error. And so at that point, what I started to do was add in some HTTP forwarding routes, and this front end component is set by default, or I believe it should be. If it's not, you can adjust that. But the back end we route the backend admin with the admin prefix, with the admin API prefix, and with the health prefix, and we set all the preserve path prefixes to true, so that when we go to those and they route to the backend. After making those changes, you should be caught up on the video. I'll continue from here. The next set of video on freezes, so it should be good to go. Just double check the YAML as I showed in the next scene, and what I mentioned while the screen was frozen was that you can go into what I experienced is you can go into your URL/admin, and that part loads, and you have access to your admin login interface. But for some reason, the front end just didn't want to serve correctly, but the back end seemed to be serving correctly. Um, and that's the point. At this point now, you have all the information, and you should be able to continue on with the video without hopefully being too lost about what steps were taken. And yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure why OBS decided to freeze on that screen, but I'm hoping you're still able to track some of that of what happened. Okay, before I actually go to bed, I was started getting curious. I just started making some quick little changes, and it seems to be up and running now. And so now I'm going to walk through exactly what I just did so I don't forget. So the first thing I would recommend trying is going into the app and going Actions, Force, Rebuild, Deploy. That was the last thing I did, but it's the first thing that I recommend trying because it's possible. Well, okay, wait, let me back up. So there's one thing that I recommend doing first. So in settings, let me think, where was that? I made change. Oh, that's right. The environment variable that we initially set on the front end, I was like, I just kind of willy-nilly set something, and I didn't really think about what it was going to be. So I came back in here and I adjusted it to be the name of the backend project, port 3001, shop API. So I renamed that to be correct. That's one thing. That's the very first thing. The next thing I recommend doing, or that I did, is I went into the app spec file and I added two things. I added the internal ports 3002. The reason why I added this is because the admin UI, if you look at the config file, at the very bottom of the backend, you'll see admin UI port 3002. This was questionable, so it may not be needed. I'm not 100% sure. I think that's what I did. I think I did those two things, and then I did actions, force rebuild, and redeploy. I recommend doing the first thing. I recommend doing the first thing first, and then doing force build redeploy. If it still doesn't work, then add the internal ports, and then do force redeploy again, and make sure you erase the cache. All right, I think that's all it took. If you are having an issue at this point, just let me know. Just like comment or tag me on something. I can try my best to help. But this is getting into sort of DevOps stuff, so I would probably refer to someone a little bit smarter than me, to be honest, on some of this stuff. But I'll always try to help. So, all right, that's it. Now I'm going to bed. I'll see you tomorrow.